A tragic accident took his family. 7 years later, he meets a boy identical to his son. The park was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that wrapped itself around you and forced you to think about the things you'd rather forget. I wasn't sure why I had gone there, of all places. 7 years had passed since the accident, but it felt like yesterday. The echoes of laughter, the warmth of a small hand clutching mine, they lingered like ghosts. My wife, my son, gone in an instant, and I had been left behind to bear the weight of their absence. I sat on a weathered bench, staring at a fountain that bubbled faintly, its sound too soft to drown out the memories. Families passed by, children running ahead of their parents, their laughter a knife to my chest. I should have left, but something held me there, as if the universe had a reason for pinning me in that spot. That's when I saw him. The boy couldn't have been older than 7 or 8, his hair tousled and golden under the late afternoon sun. He darted around the fountain, his laughter loud and free, and for a moment, my heart stopped. He looked just like Danny, the same bright smile, the same mischievous light in his eyes. It was impossible, I told myself. Danny was gone, but my mind refused to accept it. I stood without realizing it, my legs moving toward the boy as if pulled by an invisible string. He crouched to pick up a pebble, then flung it into the water with a triumphant laugh. The sound hit me like a wave, flooding my chest with a mix of longing and disbelief. Before I could get closer, a woman appeared, calling out to him, "Lucas, don't get too close to the edge." Her voice snapped me out of my trance. She was young, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail, wearing a simple cardigan over a floral dress. There was something warm and grounded about her. The way she moved with purpose yet radiated kindness. She reached for the boy. Lucas, she had called him, and he ran to her, his arms wrapping around her waist as she laughed softly. I stopped in my tracks. It wasn't them. It couldn't be. And yet, the woman glanced in my direction, her eyes meeting mine for a brief moment. I must have looked like a ghost, frozen mid-step with an expression that likely screamed everything I was feeling. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to place me, then gave a polite, if confused, smile before guiding Lucas toward the benches. My bench. I panicked, turning on my heel and walking away. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. This was absurd. Lucas was a stranger. The woman was a stranger. But the resemblance, Danny's face, his laugh, it was too much. It clawed at something deep within me, something I hadn't let myself feel in years. I leaned against a tree, far enough to avoid being seen but close enough to watch them. Lucas sat next to her, swinging his legs as he talked animatedly. She smiled, nodding at his words, and occasionally ran her fingers through his hair with the kind of tenderness that once defined my own family. The ache in my chest grew unbearable. I knew it wasn't fair to linger, to project my grief onto these strangers, but I couldn't tear myself away. Who were they? Why did this boy look so much like my son? And why did my heart refuse to let me dismiss it as a coincidence? Eventually, they stood and began walking toward the exit. I followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. It wasn't a decision, it was instinct. I needed to know more, even if I wasn't sure what I was looking for. They walked to a modest house not far from the park, Lucas bounding up the steps while the woman rummaged in her purse for keys. I stopped across the street, my fists clenching and unclenching as I debated my next move. This wasn't normal. This wasn't sane. But sanity had abandoned me years ago. Taking a deep breath, I crossed the street, my shoes scraping against the pavement louder than I intended. She looked up as I approached, her brow furrowing. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious but not unkind. I opened my mouth, then closed it, my mind scrambling for an explanation. My voice cracked. "I saw you at the park." Her expression shifted slightly, a mixture of curiosity and concern. Yes? I gestured vaguely, my hands trembling. Your son, Lucas. He reminded me of someone. Her hand tightened on the keys. That's understandable. Children have a way of doing that. Her response was polite but guarded, and I couldn't blame her. I looked down at the ground, ashamed of my desperation. I'm sorry for bothering you, I muttered, turning to leave. Wait, she said, her voice softer now. Are you all right? I hesitated, then nodded without meeting her eyes. I will be. I walked away, her gaze heavy on my back, and disappeared into the evening shadows. But as I reached my car, I knew this wasn't over. I didn't believe in coincidences, not when the boy's face haunted me with a familiarity that couldn't be explained. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to stop until I found them. The following morning, I woke up with a heavy weight on my chest. Sleep had eluded me most of the night as I replayed the events at the park and my encounter with the boy and his mother. Lucas's face haunted me, his laughter echoing in the corners of my mind. I had convinced myself that stepping away was the right thing to do, but something deeper refused to let me go. It wasn't just his resemblance to Danny. It was the ache of recognition, a feeling I couldn't explain. By noon, I found myself parked a few blocks away from their house. I hated what I was doing. I wasn't a man who stalked strangers or lingered where he wasn't wanted. But this wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about an unshakable certainty that there was more to Lucas than met the eye. I stayed in the car, watching as the hours ticked by. Lucas emerged from the house briefly, kicking a soccer ball in the yard before disappearing back inside. I couldn't make sense of the emotions coursing through me. Each time I saw him, it felt like a wound I had hidden for years was being reopened. Around mid-afternoon, the woman, his mother, came out with a bag slung over her shoulder. She looked around briefly before getting into her car. My heart raced. This was my chance to learn more, but I hesitated. Following her felt invasive, wrong even, but something told me the answers I needed wouldn't come without effort. With shaky hands, I started the engine and trailed behind her at a safe distance. She drove through town, stopping at a grocery store. I parked farther down the lot, watching as she stepped out and adjusted her bag on her shoulder. She walked with purpose, her movements graceful yet practical. I stayed in the car for a few moments, debating whether to approach her or not. Finally, I got out, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wasn't sure what I would say or how I would explain myself, but the need to act outweighed my fear. Inside the store, I found her in the produce aisle, carefully inspecting a carton of strawberries. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but there was a tiredness in her eyes that spoke of a life that hadn't been easy. "Excuse me," I said softly, stepping closer. She turned, startled at first, but then her expression shifted to recognition. "It's you," she said, her tone neither friendly nor hostile, just cautious. "I'm sorry to bother you," I began, my hands clenching nervously. I didn't mean to intrude yesterday, but I couldn't get Lucas out of my mind. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she straightened her posture. "I'm not sure I understand," she said carefully. "It's just..." I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Your son. He reminds me of someone I lost a long time ago." Her expression softened, though the wariness didn't entirely leave her face. "I see," she said after a pause. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't mean to make you uncomfortable, but his resemblance, it's uncanny," she sighed, glancing down at the strawberries before placing the carton in her basket. "Lucas is a unique boy," she said, her tone guarded. "But he's just a boy. I'm not sure what you're hoping to find." I swallowed hard, the weight of my emotions threatening to spill over. "I'm not sure either," I admitted. But when I saw him yesterday, it felt like a piece of my life that I thought I'd never see again. Her gaze lingered on me, her lips pressing into a thin line. Loss does strange things to us, she said softly. It makes us see connections that aren't there. I wanted to argue, to tell her that this was different, that it wasn't just grief clouding my judgment. But the truth was, I didn't know how to prove it. Instead, I nodded, forcing a tight smile. You're probably right, I said, though the words felt hollow. I'm sorry for bothering you. She studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod. Take care of yourself, she said, her tone gentle but firm, before walking away. I stood there, watching her disappear down the aisle, my chest aching with a sense of defeat. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was just my mind playing tricks on me, a desperate attempt to fill the void that Danny had left behind. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than coincidence. I left the store, my shoulders heavy with doubt, and returned to my car. The afternoon sun was warm, but it did little to ease the chill in my heart. As I drove home, I replayed the conversation in my head, analyzing every word, every expression. She hadn't dismissed me outright, but there was something in her tone that felt like she was holding back. Was it simply the wariness of a mother protecting her child? Or was there something she wasn't telling me? By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was more determined than ever. If Lucas truly was just a boy, then I would accept it and move on. But if there was even the slightest chance that he was connected to my past, I owed it to myself and to Danny to find the truth. The days that followed were a blur of restless thoughts and unanswered questions. I tried to focus on my routine, on the things that once anchored me to reality, but every moment I wasn't occupied. My mind wandered back to Lucas and his mother. Her guarded demeanor and the way she had spoken about loss lingered in my memory, like fragments of a puzzle I couldn't yet piece together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I found myself drawn to the park where I had first seen them. It was quiet now, the laughter of children replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of leaves in the cool evening breeze. I sat on a bench near the same spot, my eyes scanning the paths as if expecting them to appear again. Minutes turned to hours, and just as I began to resign myself to the quiet solitude of the evening, I heard the soft thud of a soccer ball. My breath caught, and I turned toward the sound. There he was, Lucas, kicking the ball with the kind of joy and abandon that only a child could muster. His mother sat on a nearby bench, her attention divided between watching him and flipping through a book in her lap. I hesitated, unsure if I should approach. A part of me wanted to turn around and leave, to avoid the risk of appearing intrusive or desperate. But the other part, the one driven by an unrelenting need for answers, pushed me to stay. I stood, slowly making my way toward them, my heart pounding with each step. As I got closer, Lucas noticed me first. His bright, curious eyes met mine, and he paused mid-kick, holding the ball in place with his foot. "Hi," he said, his voice cheerful and unguarded. "Hi, Lucas," I replied, my tone gentle. "How are you?" He grinned, his youthful energy lighting up his face. "Good. Wanna play?" He nudged the ball toward me, his enthusiasm impossible to resist. Before I could respond, his mother looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to mild concern. She stood, closing her book and placing it on the bench. "Lucas, honey, don't bother him," she said, her tone firm but kind. "It's no bother," I interjected quickly, offering her a reassuring smile. "I was just passing by and thought I'd say hello." She studied me for a moment, her eyes searching for hidden motives. Finally, she nodded, though the caution in her posture remained. "All right," she said, "but only for a few minutes. It's getting late." Lucas beamed and kicked the ball toward me, his laughter filling the air as we began a light-hearted game. His joy was infectious, and for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't known I was missing: hope. As we played, I couldn't help but notice the way his movements mirrored Danny's at that age. The way he tilted his head when he concentrated. The way his laughter bubbled over with unfiltered happiness. It was uncanny. I stole a glance at his mother, who watched us with a mix of curiosity and something else I couldn't quite place. Sadness, perhaps? Or was it suspicion? After a while, Lucas grew tired and plopped down on the grass, his small chest rising and falling with exertion. "You're good at soccer," he said between breaths, looking up at me with admiration. "Not as good as you," I replied, sitting down beside him. "You've got some serious skills." He laughed, the sound warming something deep inside me. "Mom says I get it from my dad," he said casually, his words hitting me like a bolt of lightning. "Lucas," his mother called sharply, her voice cutting through the moment like a knife. She approached quickly, her expression a mix of alarm and apology. "It's time to go." Lucas looked disappointed but obeyed, getting up and brushing the grass off his pants. "Okay, Mom," he said, his cheerful demeanor undeterred. She turned to me, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Thank you for playing with him," she said, her tone polite but distant. "But I think it's best if we keep our interactions brief." I stood, feeling the weight of her words, but unwilling to let the moment end without addressing the elephant in the room. "I understand," I said carefully, "but I can't help feeling like there's more to this. Lucas reminds me so much of my son, of Danny." Her eyes flickered, the name clearly stirring something within her. She opened her mouth as if to respond but quickly closed it, shaking her head. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said after a pause. "But Lucas has nothing to do with your past. Are you sure about that?" I pressed gently, my voice tinged with desperation, "because I can't shake this feeling that—" "Stop," she interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "Whatever you think you see, it's just a coincidence. Please let it be." Her words stung, but it was the pain in her eyes that silenced me. She turned, taking Lucas by the hand and walking away without another word. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching them disappear into the distance. The evening air grew colder, but I barely noticed. Her reaction only deepened my conviction that there was more to Lucas's story than she was willing to admit. But how could I uncover the truth without alienating them further? The question lingered, unanswered. As I made my way back to my car, the ache in my chest heavier than ever. I couldn't let it go. Every moment that passed after the encounter in the park felt like a missed opportunity, a step further away from understanding the truth. Lucas's words haunted me, particularly the casual mention of his father. "Mom says I get it from my dad." That sentence played over and over in my head, each repetition fueling a storm of questions I couldn't answer. The next morning, I decided to take a different approach. Showing up at the park again would feel too intrusive, and I doubted she would bring Lucas back anytime soon after last night's tension. Instead, I headed to a small diner on the edge of town, a place I'd noticed her walk past on my first day here. The diner wasn't much: worn linoleum floors, red vinyl booths, and a long counter with stools that creaked when you sat on them. It had a charm that only small-town America could conjure. As I nursed a lukewarm cup of coffee, my eyes scanned the street through the window. Hours seemed to drag by, and I began to doubt my instincts when, at last, I saw her. She walked briskly, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. Her long coat swayed slightly with each step, and she carried a grocery bag in one hand. I stood quickly, almost knocking over my coffee in my haste, and rushed to the door. She didn't notice me until I was a few feet away. When she turned and saw me, Her face immediately hardened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp and defensive. "I'm not here to bother you," I said, raising my hands in a gesture of surrender. "I just want to talk. Please." Her eyes darted toward the street, as if looking for an escape route. "I told you last night. There's nothing to talk about." "I think there is," I said softly. "And I think you know it too." She sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly, and for a moment, I thought she might just walk away. But then, to my surprise, she nodded toward a small bench nearby. "5 minutes," she said. "That's all you get." We sat down, the bench cold beneath us. She placed the grocery bag on the ground, folding her hands tightly in her lap as if bracing herself. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her tone weary but less hostile. "I want to understand," I said honestly. "Lucas, he reminds me so much of my son, Danny. It's not just his face or the way he moves, it's everything." And when he mentioned his dad last night, I hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question burning inside me. "Please, just tell me, who is his father?" Her reaction was immediate. Her face turned pale, and her hands clenched tighter. "That's none of your business," she said firmly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not trying to pry," I said, though my desperation was hard to hide. "But if there's even the slightest chance that Lucas is connected to Danny, I need to know. Please." For a long moment, she said nothing. Her eyes stared straight ahead, unfocused, as if she were replaying a memory she couldn't escape. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lucas's father. He's gone." "Gone?" I echoed, my heart sinking. "What do you mean?" "He left before Lucas was born," she said, her tone flat and emotionless. "I haven't seen him since. He doesn't even know Lucas exists." The words hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to believe her, to accept her story and walk away, but something about the way she said it didn't sit right. There was pain in her voice, yes, but also something else, something guarded. "And you've never tried to contact him?" I asked carefully. She shook her head. "Why would I?" "He made his choice." There was finality in her words, but it wasn't enough to quiet the storm inside me. "I'm sorry," I said after a long pause. "I didn't mean to bring up painful memories." She sighed again, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Look, I get it," she said, her tone softening. "You've been through a lot. Losing your family. I can't even imagine that kind of pain. But Lucas and we're not a part of your story. We're just trying to live our lives." Her words stung, but I couldn't blame her for saying them. From her perspective, I was just a stranger projecting my grief onto her and her son. But I knew there was more to this, even if she couldn't, or wouldn't, admit it. "Thank you for talking to me," I said finally, standing up. "I won't bother you again." She looked up at me, her expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice tinged with something that almost sounded like regret. I walked away, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to let it go, to accept her story and move on. But the other part, the part driven by a father's instinct, refused to give up. There was something she wasn't telling me. I was sure of it. That night, as I sat alone in my motel room, I pulled out the last photograph I had of Danny. He was 6 years old, his gap-toothed smile lighting up the frame. My thumb traced the edges of the photo, and I felt the familiar ache in my chest. "I'll find the truth," I whispered, my voice resolute. "For you." The days that followed were a blur of restless thoughts and sleepless nights. My mind kept replaying every word she had said, every subtle shift in her expression, every hesitation in her voice. Her story didn't add up, no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise. Something about the way she spoke of Lucas's father, the way her voice cracked when she said he didn't know about his son. it didn't feel like the whole truth. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was protecting something, or someone, and the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that Lucas wasn't just a coincidence. He was a thread, tied tightly to the family I had lost, and I needed to follow it to the end. The turning point came on a cold, rainy evening. I had been sitting in my car, parked on a quiet street near the park where I had first met Lucas. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, the rhythm oddly soothing despite the storm inside me. I was staring at the photograph of Danny, the edges worn from years of handling, when I caught a glimpse of movement through the windshield. It was her. She was walking briskly, her coat pulled tightly around her as she carried what looked like a stack of papers under one arm. She disappeared into a small brick building at the end of the street. The sign above the door read County Records Office. My pulse quickened. What could she possibly be doing there? For a moment, I considered leaving, respecting the boundaries she had so clearly drawn. But something told me this wasn't a coincidence. Gathering my resolve, I stepped out of the car and followed her inside. The office was dimly lit and smelled faintly of old paper. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, and a single clerk sat behind a counter, typing slowly on an outdated computer. She was at the far end of the room, flipping through a large binder. Her back was to me, and I hesitated, unsure how to approach her without making her feel cornered. I cleared my throat softly, and she turned sharply, her eyes widening in surprise. "You again," she said, her voice laced with equal parts annoyance and disbelief. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I didn't mean to intrude. I saw you come in, and I thought maybe—" "Maybe what?" she interrupted, her tone sharp. "That you could follow me and keep asking questions I've already answered?" Her frustration was palpable, but there was something else beneath it. Fear. It flickered in her eyes, just for a moment, before she turned away and focused on the binder again. "I'm not here to bother you," I said softly, "but I can't ignore this. Lucas isn't just a random boy I happened to meet. There's something connecting us, and you know it." She froze, her fingers tightening on the edge of the binder. For a long moment, she said nothing, and I wondered if I had pushed her too far. But then she sighed, a sound heavy with exhaustion, and closed the binder. "Fine," she said, turning to face me fully. "You want the truth? You want to know who Lucas's father is?" Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the storm inside her. "It's you." The words hit me like a freight train. I felt the air leave my lungs, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. "What?" I whispered, barely able to form the word. "You heard me," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "You're his father." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. I stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. "That's not possible," I said finally, shaking my head. "I don't understand." She crossed her arms, her expression softening slightly. "You don't remember me, do you?" I blinked, the question catching me off guard. "Remember you?" I echoed. "We met years ago," she said, her voice quieter now. "You were devastated, barely able to stand. I didn't know who you were then, just a man who had lost everything. But we talked, and one thing led to another." Her words opened a floodgate of memories. I remembered that night, how the weight of my grief had driven me to the brink. I remembered the kind woman who had sat beside me, offering a listening ear when I thought no one cared. "Oh my God," I murmured, the pieces falling into place. "That was you." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't know I was pregnant until weeks later," she said. "And by the time I tried to find you, you were gone. I didn't even know your name." Her words hung in the air, the weight of them almost too much to bear. I felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: shock, guilt, disbelief, and, above all, a profound sense of connection. Lucas was my son. My son. I didn't tell you before because I didn't want to disrupt your life, she continued, her voice trembling. I saw how much pain you were in that night, and I thought it was better this way. I stared at her, my mind racing. You should have told me, I said, my voice cracking. I would have been there for you. For him. I know, she said softly, but it's too late for regrets now. What matters is what you're going to do next. Her words grounded me, pulling me out of my whirlwind of thoughts. She was right. This wasn't about the past anymore. It was about Lucas and the future we could still build together. I want to be part of his life, I said firmly. If you'll let me. She studied me for a long moment, her gaze searching for sincerity. Finally, she nodded. We'll take it one step at a time. Relief washed over me, and for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. Lucas wasn't just a reminder of what I had lost. He was a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to create something new. I couldn't ignore the weight in my chest as I walked back to the small house, the boy trailing just a few steps behind me. His presence was a strange mixture of solace and torment, a constant reminder of the family I had lost. My hands trembled as I opened the door, the creak of the hinges echoing in the stillness. I could feel his eyes on me, his curiosity burning like a quiet flame. Inside, I motioned for him to take a seat at the modest dining table. He climbed into the chair with the kind of care only a child and used to comfort might show. His small hands rested on the edge of the table, and his eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. It was as if he were trying to piece together who I was from the sparse furniture and faded photographs on the walls. Are you hungry? I asked, my voice rougher than I intended. He nodded, and I busied myself in the kitchen, pulling together something simple. As I worked, my thoughts raced. Who was this child? Why did he resemble my son so much? I had asked those questions 1,000 times since seeing him, but now that we were here, under the same roof, the answers felt more urgent than ever. I placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him, and he whispered a soft thank you before digging in. I sat across from him, studying his features, the slope of his nose, the shape of his chin, the way his hair curled at the edges. They were all so achingly familiar. And yet, what's your name? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan, he said, his small voice steady. The name was foreign to me, but it didn't change the way my heart clenched at the sound of it. I reached for a glass of water, trying to steady myself, but my hands were shaking too much to lift it. Ethan. He fell asleep almost instantly, his breathing steady and calm. I stood in the doorway, watching him, my heart a swirling mix of pain and hope. 7 years ago, I had lost my family, but now, it felt like I had found a piece of them again. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to click on the card to explore more inspiring and emotional tales like this one. We'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments the themes you'd like us to cover in future stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. I truly enjoy reading every single one of them.